Good morning. Welcome back to our shop just outside Kennesaw here in North Georgia. My name is Larry. This is part 2 on the restoration of this incredibly beautiful quarter-sawn oak table from the turn of the 20th century. In the last video we went into pretty significant detail on how we disassembled, identified the issues, and began the repairs in this table. This is one of the leg assemblies. As you remember, the leg assemblies were just an absolute bear to get out of their frames. And then once we got them out, we found that all the joints really had failed. There were some poor repairs that needed to be corrected, and they had to be reattached. I let them set overnight, came into the shop very early this morning, unclamped them, and then made the final attachments, which is what you see here. These columns were attached this morning. So this assembly needs to just set so that this gets good and hard before we start to try to manipulate it and remount it. So from a time perspective, what I'm going to do is take apart the other leg assembly and get all these similar repairs taken care of this morning. You've seen me do this on this side. There's no sense watching me do it again. If there's something different or unusual, I'll bring you along. Once these are done, we'll take the next step, and that's how we're going to mount these into their frames. And remember, we had those holes that were oval, and I believe I've got that figured out. I believe I've got a fix for that, and I'm going to share it with you when we come back. But right now, I'm going to beg you, let me kind of turn off the camera and get to work, because I've got to do all the stuff we did yesterday all over again on the other legs. So I will bring you back when that's done.
Hey Stuart, guess what we found? Gorilla Glue. Can you believe it? Gorilla Glue.
I popped off this column off of this corbel, or whatever you want to call it, and it's somebody's been here ahead of me with a bottle of Gorilla Glue, and we know that stuff is about worthless, and we never use it on furniture repairs in this shop. This joint needed to be re-glued, and rather than re-glue it and clamp it, they squirted Gorilla Glue in here, and the Gorilla Glue expands. It's an expanding, I think it's a polyurethane foam, and it's helped separate this joint and contaminated it. So I've got to get all of that out before I can even attempt to try to bring this joint back together. I may not be able to, thanks to whoever used the Gorilla Glue on this. But just a warning, please don't use Gorilla Glue on furniture repairs. It's not a crack filler. It has no strength unless it's in complete contact with the wood. If you're interested, Matthias Wandel on YouTube did a strength test with Gorilla Glue, and you know, it's comparable to PVA glue when you have a good joint, but it has absolutely no strength as a crack filler, which it's advertised to do. All right, let me see if I can get this cleaned up. I'm actually using a handsaw to get in the split, and as you would expect, that split right in two, just like the other one did. This is the other half. You can see the Gorilla Glue still in there. I've got to get cleaned out. So we'll get the glue cleaned off, get the Gorilla Glue cleaned out of there on both sides, glue it back together just like we did the other one, and keep going forward. And that's back together now with hide glue. Let that set overnight. Let's try a chip repair. You can see right here this little piece of, I guess it's called the corbel, has come off. So what I've got here is some thin super glue and a micro pipette. This is where I normally glue my fingers to the work. Like that. A little accelerator. Hold it down. It's all done, just like that. Well, as I said earlier, just about every joint on all of these leg assemblies came apart, either on their own or they were loose and had to be disassembled and re-glued to return the stability to this table. And it's just to show you how worn the adhesive was on this project. We even have one of the layers of the carved feet fell off. Just like that. So our job is to put it back on. So what do you say we put it back on? Of course, both of these surfaces have been scraped clean of any glue or dirt before we attempted to rejoin them. We're using hot hide glue like we have on most of this project. Now with hide glue you can do what's called a rub, I guess it's a rub glue or whatever, but if you go back and forth with the glue as it starts to tack up, and it will pretty soon into the procedure, it'll grab, and that'll help you. Okay, another day of repairing the legs is now behind us. These two legs are the set we did the first day. There's part of the set from the second day. There's another one of them right there. So we get them all put together and let the glue set. Tomorrow we'll start to reassemble this. So thanks for hanging out in the shop another day with me. Probably 3-4 hours this morning, but we're on hold for glue drying time, so we'll come back tomorrow and see if we can put this thing together.
The owner tells me that some of the mounting screws for this leg mounting assembly, I guess we'll call it an H assembly or whatever, are stripped out. So what I'm doing here is putting that assembly onto the table to identify exactly which holes we need to get it in the original mounting position. There are holes all over the mounting boards. That's because this thing has been moved so many times. So what I'm doing here is just dropping some awls or ice picks down into the holes, peering underneath the H bracket assembly, and now I'm using the screws and running them into the holes to determine which of the holes are stripped and need to be filled. There are lots of ways to fill stripped out screw holes. What I've decided to do in this job is to drill them out and plug them with dowels. That's a 3/8 inch drill bit. I'm just drilling out the stripped holes that I marked earlier in anticipation of filling them with a hardwood dowel. And with the holes drilled out, I'm I'm using a stick to apply some epoxy to the holes in anticipation of inserting the dowels. And then we put a little bit of epoxy on the end of the dowel, and in it goes. That's a 3/8 inch dowel, and it's a pretty tight fit. I believe I did notch the dowel. I carved a little line on the side to let some air come out of it, but in general that's going in fairly tight, and that's what you want. And here we're just wiping up our mess, get the epoxy off of there before it dries, You could use acetone as well, but I'm just using a rag. And the last step is to cut the dowel flush. I'm using a Japanese back saw that I'm fairly fond of. There we go, just that easy. Nice and flat, job's done. And here it is up close, all ready for screws.
Okay, it's time to earn our pay. We have these holes here where the leg assemblies mount into. When we first took it apart, we thought these had been wallowed out. And then we noticed this ridge line right here, which is indicative of a double drilling. And the other thing that we noticed was that the opposite side of this frame, the holes were not wallowed out. They were standard. So what I did is I measured the diameter of this hole, and I basically just did so by holding a hole saw over it until I found one that fit. And it's 1.5 inches. Because this is a factory-made piece of furniture, it was easy for me to conclude that the other hole was going to be 1.5 inches, which it was. And as fate turns out, the dowels that are turned into the end of our columns are 1.5 inches. So when we assemble or dry assemble this, let this represent the dowel of the column. That's going to be here. What I believe occurred, and please, if you've got any information to the contrary, feel free to put them in the comments, was that when these were assembled, this was probably done this way to facilitate ease of assembly. In other words, they could put the other column in that couldn't move, and this would give them a little room to swing the other column in. And then they probably followed up with a crescent-shaped piece of wood that looked just like that locked that joint tight. The question then becomes, how do we make one of these? Now, I made this one by templating this and cutting it on the jigsaw, and it came out pretty good. I take credit for it, but if this hole and this hole have the same diameter, if I take this and put it there, let me bring you around, and then trace this, this should be our crescent shape that's going to fit. So then the question becomes, well, how do we best cut this? Should we cut this by hand on the bandsaw? Sure, that would work. Or we could just take our 1.5 inch hole saw, offset it, and run it through here and make this cut. So the next question becomes, after we mark it, how do we hold the work? And what I've come up with is just to hot melt glue one of these 1.5 inch, I guess, circles or whatever that we made onto a piece of scrap pine and cut them. And by the way, this was cut out with an 1.5 inch hole saw on some red oak blanks that I had. So if we can cut this part off, we should have left what we need. So let's give it a try. And this is the piece we want. Hopefully it'll fit. Let's give it a whirl. And to get hot melt glue to release, you can heat it up, or sometimes if you just give it a little tap, it'll let go like that. And you can peel off any residual with a chisel. Look at that. I think that's going to act real good as a wedge for what we're trying to do. Remember, the turned ends of those dowels are a little bit irregular, so we're going to do this whole joint in epoxy with some filler in it to fill in these little gaps.
but I think this is going to do for us, and I do believe that this is the shape of what was in there, and they're missing on all four sides. So we'll create all four of these, put them in there, and use them to mount the legs in there. Hopefully they will fit against the legs, but we'll see, and if they don't, we can adjust them. And I'm sorry I rushed through the hot melt glue section of the video here. Hot melt glue is basically it's a solid tube. You heat it up in a gun and it comes out, you squeeze it, it comes out hotter than heck, so be careful, don't get it on your fingers because it does burn. But if you just press it down and hold it, just give it a couple of seconds to cool down. It grabs pretty well. It's a pretty handy tool. I know a lot of times people use it for crafting and things and think, oh, it's not for around the shop, but it sure is. Something like this saved us a whole lot of aggravation, so keep it in mind, hot melt glue. And I'm dry fitting the first one, and you can see how nicely that wedge is going to push this right up against the top, or what would be the inside of this egged out hole, and mount it in nice and securely. And then here's the other one in the round hole. So I think we figured it out. It's the first time I've ever seen this system. If anybody has any experience with it, let me know. Well, the next step is to mix up some epoxy and start to put this back together again. Okay, I haven't got these tapped in yet, but I think they're going to be a real good fit. So what I'm going to do now is disassemble everything, mix up some epoxy, get some epoxy on everything, put it together. And I'm going to take advantage of those nail holes, drive some screws in there to act like clamps, and after everything dries we'll take the screws out. Okay, we're nice and tight here. We're nice and tight there. And there's our oak wedge that we put in. We put 2 screws in to pull it tight until the epoxy sets up. I think we've got it. Okay, I've got that one to do, and then 2 more. Let me get to it. Well, that's a big step back towards getting this table put back together. I'm real happy that problem has been solved. Well, after a heck of a lot of work, the legs are all back together. Almost every single joint in these legs, including assembly joints, where pieces of wood were joined together, were compromised and had to be taken apart, cleaned, clamped, re-glued. With all that done, we remounted the legs onto the frames, the H-frames. Then we used those half-moon wedges that we made, got them in there, got everything down nice and tight. So it's all just sitting here now getting hard. So we're going to leave it overnight, let the adhesive harden up. Then we'll mount the legs and the pedestal back on the underside of the table. We'll flip it over, make sure everything works just the way we want it, and we'll be done. So stick with us. We're almost at the end of the road. See you tomorrow. Good morning. It's the day we've been waiting for. It's time to put these legs back on this table, get it all put together, get it on its way home. Here we go.
And if you remember, we plugged a number of the holes that this assembly mounts to this board with. So what I've done is the good holes, I've lined up and inserted the screws in there, so we've got this positioned exactly as it needs to go. Now the next thing I have to do is drill a pilot hole into the plugs that we put in so we can drive the screw. This is very hard to see, but the size of the drill bit should be just about the size of the shank, not including the threads. And I normally go one size smaller. She's not stripped anymore. Let me get the rest of them. Well, it sure looks pretty all put back together. But sometimes you run into some unexpected issues. And we have one of those right now. Let me show you what we're dealing with. This center column mounts to the third rail of the extension assembly. And as you remember, we moved this extension assembly back towards where it was supposed to be, or at least we thought it was supposed to be originally. And the reason we did that is we thought that was the original mounting position and that it would be the strongest and the best for the table. Well, no good deed goes unpunished, I suppose. If you look right here, you can see we're about 3/4 of an inch too far away from the edge of this mounting board to screw this efficiently into that third rail. I'm not going to cob this. I'm not going to try to attach a piece of wood to this. What we're going to do is take everything back off and we're going to move this rail so it lines up with this before we mount it back. It's heartbreaking. It's not that much more work. It's just one of those things that sometimes happens. And when you're getting to the end of a project, you have to stay focused and understand if you have an issue like this, this is not the time to shortcut it. Go get a cup of coffee, get a cup of tea, walk away from it if you're frustrated, but come back and do it right. So we're going to do it right, so everything's coming back off. We'll try to figure out exactly where these extension assemblies are supposed to go. Is a pretty daunting task because there's nothing to really reference them off of, because these are mounted different distances from the edge of the table. This one's 5 3/4. That one's at least 6. And again, everything's been taken off and put back, so I don't know what the original measurements are. So what I've done is I've used a tape measure and centered this center column the best I can. Now mind you, I mounted the center column with all 6 screws to the slide assemblies, so we keep that critical distance consistent, and I've got it really within about 1/8 of an inch of dead center. Now I'm measuring off to this internal curve here, and as you can see, if you can see over to this side, because this is an antique, that no longer lines up. And that's just expected wear. So finding this critical mark is a bit of a challenge. But once we've got this column centered, we can screw down these extension assemblies and then put the legs back on and make sure the legs don't interfere or don't hit this column when the table's all the way closed. And then we can take the legs off, make sure the extension assembly still functions correctly, and if it does, close everything up and put the legs back on. I don't know any other way of doing that. Pretty complicated little puzzle. With the column mounted, the slide mechanism is working the way it should. Be a bit of an adventure to close this myself. Okay, it's closed. Let's put the legs on. We'll drop some pins into the holes, the mounting holes, and make sure that they don't hit the column. Okay, I think we've got it. It's all done. It's all put back together. All I've got left to do is polish the legs with some wax and get my friend over here to help me turn this thing back up on its feet and it's ready to go home. All right, as you remember, when this table came to us, we had a complete break on one of these that was being held together with a clamp. The legs were all loose. We have absolutely no movement in these legs. When I shake these legs, if you see any movement, it's because it's rocking the table. You can see right there the moving blanket is wiggling. So everything's rock solid. Everything's back together. I'm happy with it. I will wait until we get this flipped over so you can see what this thing looks like. Now it does have 4 wheels. The owner has those wheels at his home. So when we set this on the ground, it's going to be setting flat on that column, but that column will be raised up by the height of the wheels when the table's completely assembled. It's beautiful. I'm glad I was a part of it. It needed all the work that it got, but man, I tell you what, this was a lot of work. Once we get it flipped over, I'll show you what it looks like on its feet. Here it is, all done. Back on her feet where she belongs. Looks gorgeous. From our shop just outside Kennesaw here in North Georgia. Best regards, thanks for watching, take good care, and remember, it's just wood, color, some shiny stuff, glue, dowels, and a whole heck of a lot of work. I'm glad this one's done, I'm happy with it. Y'all take care, we'll see you next video. Bye.